the end of the 19th century, we find German philosophers and neurologists combining their expertise to create a new science of the mind, which would be given the name of Phenomenology. Phenomenology was established as a discipline to study the nature of consciousness. Psychoanalysis, however, had its target primarily set on the unconscious. All the yada yada, all the ich coming off the couch, let us remember, was for Freud just that, a box of psychic content, a sort of pick-and-mix selection of received opinions and neurotic expostulations. But by furrowing around in this box of conscious ich, Freud hoped he might break through to something more primal, or at least something more meaningful, some sort of jewel of inner awakening and insight, which would resolve the central suffering koan, or paradox, of this absurd creature's life, so that they might, somewhat mournfully, get on with things without being plagued by their overwhelming and undefended, distressful symptoms. Art, and the study of art, known as aesthetics, became a common point of convergence for these two other disciplines. Psychologists began to see how looking at people's emotional responses to art and the motivations that drove some to create it could help explain aspects of human nature that had never been fully grasped before. One of these conundrums might be conceptualized by the following question: what is a self? An I, a conscious and self-conscious ego? And what universal or variable factors might lie at the heart of such a phenomenon? One figure who was especially interested in this new discipline of psychology was Theodor Lipps. Lipps had been taking note of the work done in the 1860s by the German doctor Wilhelm Wundt, who had begun researching neurological phenomena like reaction time to stimuli, and in so doing had stumbled on the interesting gaps between the brain and the mind that Freud would fill in with something he called the unconscious. Lipps' research focused on why art, painting, poetry and music gives us pleasure, and in doing so, this required an understanding of the subjective elements at play when we look at a piece of art. Something his contemporary, the art historian Alois Riegel, called the beholder's involvement. Some essence inside us, inside the beholder, is being touched or spoken to when we interact with a work of art. In some way, the act of looking or reading then becomes a kind of creative process, and the viewer, in tackling the koan of an artwork, of a poem or a piece of music, or a novel or a play, also in some way becomes the artist. How does this happen? Lipps found a name for his theory in an 1873 dissertation by a German aesthetic student named Robert Fischer. When people project their emotions, ideas, or memories onto objects, they enact a process that Fischer called Einfühlung, which literally means feeling into. The British psychologist Edward Titchener translated the word into English in 1909 as empathy, deriving his English word from the Greek empathia, or in pathos. For Fischer, Einfühlung, feeling into, revealed why a work of art causes an observer to unconsciously, quote, move in and with all the forms. He dubbed this bodily mimesis muscular empathy, a concept that resonated with Lipps, who once attended a dance recital and felt himself striving and performing with the dancers. He also linked this idea to other somatosensory sensations and imitations like yawns and laughter. Paradoxically, empathy is by definition a somewhat selfish emotion. We empathize with the external in order to enjoy or appreciate something of this in ourselves. We do this in order, we might say, to find ourselves, to find and see the contours of the self, the ego, our ego, which is always looking for ways in which it might self itself into the world and the lives of those people we inhabit it with. Empathy is both life-affirming and ego-affirming. It allows us to permeate and move through the world. No ego, no go-go. Freud certainly read Lipps' work. We know this because he wrote to a friend in 1896 that he had immersed himself in the teachings of Lipps, quote, who I suspect has the clearest mind among present-day philosophical writers. He would later go on to argue that Lipps's research demonstrates that empathy should be embraced by psychoanalysts as a tool for understanding patients, urging his students to observe their patients not from a place of judgment, but from a place of empathy. The empathic self ought to recede into the background like a, quote, receptive organ and strive towards the, quote, putting of oneself in the other person's place. At the turn of the last century, as I have suggested, artists and psychoanalysts were not entirely distinctive categories as they are now. And so it is no surprise that Freud's initial research into the I, into the ego, is exactly the kind of thing that the poet Rainer Maria Rilke found himself drawn to when in 1902, at the age of 26, he managed to get a gig shadowing the artist Auguste Rodin, who was at that point 2 generations ahead of him, a man in his 60s. The ostensible reason for doing this was that Rilke wanted to write a monograph about the I, in both senses of the word, of Rodin, which he would go on to do. Like Joshua following Moses to the Promised Land, writes Rachel Corbett in her fantastic book about the meeting of these 2 figures, Rilke saw this journey as the beginning of a new future, a new understanding. The plan was to immerse himself in Rodin's praxis and philosophy so as to write a long and potentially unique essay on the artist, and in so doing perhaps more fully understand and develop Rilke's own artistry, which, like everything he would focus on and write about, was always intrinsically exploratory and reference towards the Ich, the essence of his egoic manifestation in the world, as this thinking, talking, love-seeking poetry missile we now call Rainer Maria Rilke. Having let Rilke trail around with him for a few days, Rodin tired of the young German snoop and decided he needed some space to himself. He would visit a friend in Italy, and perhaps Rilke could get on with something else for a while, like the writing up of his monograph. So he suggested Rainer might want to try out an assignment which Rodin himself had undertaken as a student many years before. Regardez les animaux, Professor Barry had told the young Rodin. To the aspiring figurative sculptor, staring at so-called beasts, looking at animals, had seemed a second-rate task. But in Regarding les animaux, Rodin soon understood why non-human animals have been objects of reverence for artists dating back to Neolithic cave painters. Now, Rodin too would impart this quasi-shamanic teaching to the young fanboy Rilke. Regardez les animaux. In a letter to his somewhat estranged wife, Clara, Rilke describes how, quote, Rodin has a tiny plaster cast, a tiger, antique, in his studio, which he values very highly. And from this little plaster cast, I see what he means, what antiquity is, and what links him to it. There, in this animal, is the same lively feeling in the modelling. This little thing, it is no higher than my hand, is wide and no longer than my hand, has hundreds of thousands of sides, like a very big object, hundreds of thousands of sides which are all alive, animated and different. And that in plaster! Exclamation mark. And with this, the expression of the prowling stride is intensified to the highest degree, the powerful planting of the broad paws, and at the same time that caution in which all strength is wrapped, that noiselessness. And in a way, he is also probably describing Rodin here too. The panther Rilke will study in the Jardin des Plantes, at the zoo as we might call it, in his bid to follow Rodin's Regardez les animaux injunction, begins, even in this letter, to find its words, to find expression. A tiny plaster tiger with a prowling stride and broad paws. The gaze, both the poet's own as well as the non-human animal, united in some mutually understood sense of desperation. Rodin's surfaces are there to suggest a reality that can only be inferred, just as fingers or a face, by gesture or expression, disclose a consciousness that would otherwise be indiscernible. Sculptures, Rilke realizes, are things. They start as stuff taken from other stuff, like rock or clay, and they stay stuff until the artist gives them a determinate form, so that through this form they may have what we would call life. The poet's problem is precisely the opposite. Language is our most important sign of elevated awareness, but language has a very weak presence. Often on paper, or even in a podcast like this one, it possesses no weight. A poem is like a ghost seeking substantiality, a soul in search of a body. It is consequently not the message in a bottle that Rilke previously thought it was, nor a young man's feelings raised up like a flag. All of us have these emotions that are often urgently seeking some kind of release. However, the poet must also be a maker, as the Greeks maintained, and like the sculptor, like every other artist, should aim in some way at adding real beings, or real moments of being anyway, into the world, fully realized, not just things like tools and haberdashery that nature has neglected to provide, or the memos and laws that society produces in abundance, but rather the Kantian idea of the Ding an sich, the thing in itself, as it is, independent of observation and perceptual mediation. That was Rilke's aesthetic challenge as a young man, and this is the challenge he takes on when writing every sentence of every poem and thought that he wants to convey. To guide him on this journey, Rilke recalled the teachings of his old professor from Munich, Theodor Lipps, and devised a process of conscious observation which he, Rilke, would come to call, perhaps a nod to Lipps' Einfühlung, feeling into. Rilke's version of this would be called Einsehen, in other words, seeing into. Although I think when we read Rilke's poems, we can see that this also encapsulates Lipps' Einfühlung. In fact, it is both a seeing into and a feeling into happening at the same time. This seeing into describes the voyage from the surface of a thing to its heart, its essence, wherein perception leads to an emotional connection. That's the feeling side. Rilke made a point of distinguishing in-seeing or seeing into from inspecting, a term which he thought described only the viewer's perspective and thus often only results in an anthropomorphic projective identification. Seeing into, in-seeing, on the other hand, takes into account the object's point of view. It has as much to do with making things human as it does with making humans things, or making human things. If faced with a rock, for instance, one might stare deep into the place where its rockness or its rockiness begins to form. We might then keep looking until our own egoic center, our own ich, starts to sink into or feel into the stony weight of that rock forming inside us too. It is a kind of perception that takes place within the body, and so it requires the observer to be both the seer and the seen. To observe with empathy, one sees not only with the eyes, but with the skin, you might say. Though you may laugh, Rilke wrote to a friend, if I tell you where my very greatest feeling, my world feeling, my earthly bliss is, I must confess to you, it is, again and again, here and there, in this in-seeing, this seeing into, in the indescribably swift, deep, timeless moments of this godlike experience. In describing his joy at experiencing the world in this way, Rilke echoes Lipps' belief that through empathy a person might be able to free themselves from the solitude of a self, of an ego, of their egoic selfish, if you like, minds, in order to truly see and comprehend the soul of another or even an object. Although, as Freud would come to recognize in his early works on transference and countertransference, when we are looking in this deep phenomenological way into the soul of another or even a rock, are we not also, unfortunately, in some sense, always seeing ourselves, our own egos, or at least aspects of them? All of this, though, is a mere hypothesis beside the real thing-in-itself experience of Rilke on an autumn morning, somewhat like this one, grey, a bit miserly, seated in front of a large iron cage in the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. A cage that has been constructed as much to attract the artists of the day for this very purpose, for this seeing and painting, or seeing and writing, as the children being taken to the zoo by a parent looking to fill an afternoon of boredom in their pre-iPad era. There is, of course, good scientific form in this mode of inquiry that Rilke may have even been aware of, for not even 65 years before his meeting and writing about the Panther, who is, as we shall discover, himself at the Jardin des Plantes, we find Charles Darwin, recently having returned from his own important travels on the Beagle, sitting in a zoo in London admiring the first orangutan to be shown by this establishment, purchased the year before from a certain Mr. Moss for £150 and named Jenny. £150 was quite a lot of money in those days. With the help of the internet and Ian Webster's composite price index inflation calculator, I arrive at the sum of around £14,000 for the purchase of Jenny. Human slaves were being bought for similar prices at the same time, according to recent research. When Darwin met Jenny, the orangutan, on the 28th of March 1838, he was still 2 decades away from publishing The Origin of the Species, in which our long-held view of ourselves as godly humans, or even human gods, was swiftly dismantled to show our true status as humanoid animals who had achieved our so-called dominion over others and the planet through circumstantial luck, primate guile, and all the other twists and turns of the evolutionary algorithm, including a devastating asteroid impact 66 million years ago, which wiped out not just the dinosaurs, but most of life on Earth, allowing in the next few million years much smaller mammals to diversify and thrive. Some of these scurrying rat and raccoon-sized creatures eventually becoming the creatures who make podcasts and listen to them. Darwin, who was also a young father at the time, experienced Jenny behaving like just one of his own children when denied something they wanted. Initially, she would get sulky and then throw a temper tantrum and then negotiate with one of the keepers for good behavior in return for a special treat. With this in mind, he wrote in his notebook, quote, "Let us visit orang-outang in domestication, hear expressive whine, see their intelligence when spoken to, as if they understand every word said, see their affection to those they knew, see their passion and rage, sulkiness, and very actions of despair. And then let us boast of our proud preeminence. Man in his arrogance thinks himself a great work, worthy the interposition of a deity, more humble and I believe true to consider himself created from animals." End quote. Darwin visited Jenny 2 more times after this and saw how, quote, astonished beyond measure she was when she saw her reflection in a mirror. Jenny had self-consciousness just like us. Jenny had a sense of herself as a Jenny, just like us. But back to Rilke, seated in front of the Panther's cage, hour after hour, seeing and feeling himself into the non-human animal before him. The mythos around this poem is that he sat the whole day observing the panther before attempting to write. Perhaps he did. Whatever happened, however long it took, at a certain point, Rilke would have begun to experience the essence of this creature, an essence we share with all living things, our essential life force, you might say. But to put this essence into words, words always being, unless reduced to legalese or academic hoity-toity, the carapace of the self, the ego. So to do that, understandably, in this portrait of an other, we find an I emerging, Rilke's I, Rilke's Ich, which makes the sound, in this case, of a poem. Here it is. The Panther. His vision from the constantly passing bars has grown so weary that it cannot hold anything else. It seems to him there are 1,000 bars, and behind the bars no world. As he paces in cramped circles over and over, the movement of his powerful soft strides is like a ritual dance around a centre in which a mighty will stands paralyzed. Only at times the curtain of the pupils lifts quietly, an image enters in, rushes down through the tensed, arrested muscles, plunges into the heart, and is gone. A poem allows us to take thousands upon thousands of experiential sketches made in our minds as we interact with the world, all the thoughts and the feelings and the fleeting glimpses of truth and falsehood, and turn these into something that feels embodied in the same way that we feel ourselves to be embodied at times, which is to say, we begin to feel our ich, our ego. The Panther becomes a living koan of the self, something which both encapsulates and can, of course, never be fully encapsulated. This process he had also learned from Rodin, who would sit and make drawings the way other humans might shed skin cells. In other words, 500 million of them a day, if we're going to take that analogy seriously. Here is a passage I love about this process, the process of Rodin's drawings, which Rilke published a year later in his monograph. Quote, "Lines have never been so expressive and yet so unintentional, even in the most extraordinary Japanese drawings. For there is no representation here, no plan or purpose, and no trace of a name, no trace of a self, we might say, right? And yet, what is not here? What holding on or letting go or no longer being able to hold on, what bending over, stretching out and contracting, what falling or flying has ever been seen or imagined that is not to be found again here? And it is only now, when we see it unexpectedly in these drawings, that we understand this meaning. The extremes of love, suffering, despair and bliss emanate from them, although we don't know why. We see their depravity, and it is like the growth of a plant, growing in madness because it cannot do otherwise. And a touch of blue behind a falling form is enough to bring space tumbling onto the page from all sides, enveloping the figure with so much nothingness that one grows dizzy and reaches involuntarily for the hand of the master who is holding the drawing out in a delicate, generous motion. The Ich, who reaches for this fresh, new drawing, which holds in it the glimpse of everything in the making of a contour to express another contour, a seen object. This Ich is attached, of course, in an embodied way to the hand of someone we now call Rilke. The hand that reaches is also motivated, as we can hear in the passage above, by something essential to Rilke, essential to what it means to be Rilke, who will also write that essence himself onto the page when he sees it, or rather finds it, in the shape of a panther. What might the essence of Rilke's egoic soul reveal to us if we try to put this into words, using all our knowledge of the poems transmitted through his Ich, his I, over many years, as well as the letters and the notebooks and the biographies we have of him to guide us? Equally, our ability, now a century after Freud, to apply everything we have learnt in the last 100 years about the mechanism or operating system, if you like, of the ego, of the self. This is something that I'd like to tackle in the third and final part of this exploration.
Too many birds in one tree. Too many birds in one tree. And the sky is full of black and screaming leaves. The sky is full of black and screaming. And one more bird, then one more bird, and one last bird, and another. One last blackbird without a place to land. One last blackbird without a place to be. Turns around in hopes to find the place at last knew rest. Oh, blackbird, over black rain burn. This is not where you last knew rest. You fly all night to sleep on stone, the heartless rest that in the morn will be gone. You fly all night to sleep on stone, to return to the tree with too many birds, too many birds, too many birds.